Hello, my name is Rod Peppiatt. I'm the minister in the Uniting Church in Blackburn, Victoria, meeting on the Wurundjeri country. Today, with people across the world in the churches, we think a little bit about All Saints' Day, a day when we focus on some of the people who have been influential in our faith and spiritual walk. And today I want to focus on one of the biblical characters who is one of the saints, if you like. Often on Sundays we have a contemporary reading of grace. This week we're focusing on an ancient reading of grace, which is found in the book of Ruth, chapter 1. And I'll allude to that a little bit as we go. But firstly, a story of Jesus that perhaps sets it up and talks about the values of saints. And one day a scribe, one of the religious leaders, came up to Jesus with a question. Unlike many of the others who came up on the attack to Jesus, this man wanted to know what Jesus actually thought. And so he asked him the question, "Rabbi, which commandment is the first of all?" Now we can, and we do, often understand this to be asking which commandment is the most important. And that's true, but it's not only that. It's also asking which is the one that comes first, on which all of the others rest. And for Jesus, love for God comes first, just as it did for Moses and Ruth and all of the other great ones in the story of Israel. In Deuteronomy 6, which is sort of styled as the final sermon of Moses, the commands and the laws all begin with the same words used by Jesus those centuries later. Love God with your heart, soul, mind and strength. Jesus was a Jew. He was born, he lived and died as a Jew. That was who he was. And his words in those few verses in Mark's Gospel, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and the second is like it, love your neighbour as you love yourself. These show him firmly within the traditions of his people, and they show us how he honoured that tradition and the relationship with God that the tradition was all about. But Jesus goes further with Moses. What does love for God look like? It looks like loving your neighbour as you love yourself. Note, not as much as you love yourself, but as you love yourself. This is about the quality of love, the character of love, the way it is lived. And what does that look like? It looks the same as the ways in which we are gracious to ourselves, make excuses for ourselves, celebrate our successes and regret our failings, in the ways we want the best and accept ourselves. It looks like that, at least when we get it right. And that's inextricably linked with love for God. Jesus didn't change the rules or reinterpret them. He talked about what they'd meant all along. So what does it mean to ground our life in love for God, for our neighbour and ourselves? And if asking what does it mean sounds a bit abstract, try asking what does it look like, or what could it look like? The story doesn't tell us whether the man talking to Jesus asked that exact question. But if he had, I know a story that Jesus could have told him. And it would have begun like this. There was a woman many centuries ago. Her name was Ruth. Like Jesus, Ruth wasn't a Christian. She was, in fact, an outsider to the people of Judah. She was a Moabite, at best a distant relative. And in fact, relationships between the people in Judah and of Moab were, well, fraught quite often. The great commandment was only a distant part of Ruth's heritage, if it was at all. But as we look at her story, I think we see it lived out in her. Let me share a little of that story with you. Her story took place in a tribal world, set up by men, for men, obviously. In that story, Ruth, her mother-in-law Naomi, and her sister-in-law Orpah all became widows. Now, the human tragedy of that is bad enough, especially for Naomi, who lost her husband and her sons. But even beyond that is the social tragedy. These women were now destitute, with no way of providing for themselves. And worse, if that's possible, they effectively lost their identity. They became non-people. Who they had been was on the basis of being wife of and mother of. Naomi had nothing left. She chose to go home, back to Bethlehem. And when Ruth and Orpah left with her, Orpah left when Naomi said to her and Ruth, "Go back to your people and let me go on alone to my people." To go with Naomi meant leaving their community behind. Naomi left, but Ruth would have none of it. In Ruth chapter 1, we read part of the story of Ruth that's perhaps the best known. It even gets read at weddings sometimes, her reply to Naomi. When Naomi says, "No, go back," Ruth says these words made famous: "Don't force me to leave you. Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." Stirring stuff in itself, but even more when we think about what Ruth was actually doing. She was choosing to enter a foreign and often hostile culture where she would be able to depend on nobody rather than desert a woman who may not have even wanted her around. Ruth's is such a powerful and radical and determined declaration of love and devotion that Naomi is struck dumb and runs out of arguments. Now the story continues, and if you can manage it this week, I'd encourage you to read the whole book. It's short, it's easy reading, and it's a great story in love and deep, gutsy, vulnerable, life-affirming, life-changing love. It's got some interesting little ambivalences and things that you might find curious as well. But primarily, it's about the kind of love that I've just described. And centuries before Jesus, but celebrating and living the same truth as he did. Now, some say that Ruth's honour in the scriptures is becoming the grandmother of King David. I disagree. Her honour is in being Ruth, the woman in whose compassion and love Naomi saw her God. What does godly love look like? Well, for Jesus, all of those centuries after Ruth, just like those generations of his people, it seemed to look like this. Love God, however you perceive God, with all our heart, soul, mind and strength. And love our neighbours as we love ourselves, like Ruth did. Blessings.